I'd like to start us with a question about how Americans might best respond to this crisis that has arisen in the aftermath of George Floyd's senseless killing. What do we want other democracies learning from our response?
The best argument for American democracy has never been that we are a perfect and just society. It is that we have mechanisms to correct our imperfections, to address injustices. And so the best lesson, the lesson I hope that eventually the rest of the world takes from this is that despite all of our current frailties, American democracy can still do that. That through a combination of peaceful public protest, mobilizing of civil society, free elections, which enable us to put pressure on elected politicians, a free press that exposes these problems now by being able to actually show video footage of police brutality that offends the vast majority of Americans, that all of these things together combine to offer a solution to the problem. And I think it's already happening in an interesting way. I would argue, I'll be very blunt, I don't think our leadership in the United States is doing a very good job of leading the world, but the American people still are. Look at the demonstrations now in Europe, not just in solidarity with Americans angry about George Floyd's killing, but also looking at policing issues in European countries. In Belgium, there was a statue of King Leopold, the horrible Belgian monarch who was responsible for genocide in the Congo more than 100 years ago. And that was taken down because people were inspired by protests in the United States of America. So even with our unsettled situation politically in America, we're still showing we can lead the world by example, and that inspires me.
Congressman, we're seeing a resurgence of nativism, protectionism, and isolationism around the world. What impact do you see these isms having on democracies, including our own?
I think they're a threat to democracy. I don't think they're a new threat. I think through history we see these cycles. There are aspects of human nature that do not encourage us to be kind and inclusive, that encourage us to be more selfish, to be more fearful of our fellow men and women. It is part of human nature, and democracy cannot defeat human nature. But democracy can, I think, still provides the greatest likelihood of mobilizing the better angels of human nature to prevail in situations like this. And I'm still hopeful that that will happen. Now, I know that's a pretty general response. I do think we need to be focused on some particular trends that have made it possible for some of these nativist, populist, and increasingly authoritarian movements to spread across the world and to take hold even in the United States of America at a moment in history when one might have thought they were a thing of the past. And so perhaps we should talk about some of those. And I think it's what's happened to our media and information systems that requires the greatest attention.
You touched on populism in that response. How do you see populism affecting democracies? Is it just a reaction to people who are facing economic dislocation through globalization or automation, things like that, or is there something of deeper concern when you look at the issue of populism?
I think it is a deeper problem in human nature that we have this tendency when we are feeling insecure for whatever reason to look for simple solutions to our problems, to blame somebody for those problems. The problems can be economic in nature. It can be job loss and dislocation. It can be the sense that it can be insecurity with regard to terrorism, for example, or immigration. And whenever people feel that way, we've historically seen leaders arise who take advantage of it for very selfish ends by encouraging suffering people to seize upon a simple solution and somebody to blame. That's always been with us. And of course, it's a threat to democracy, especially if you define democracy as not just the will of the majority, but a system that respects human rights, competing opinions, that places checks on the authority of those who have been elected. That's what's being threatened right now. And interestingly, it's happening simultaneously in multiple countries around the world.
I'd like to pivot, if I can, to the role of American leadership in the world. What do you see as the effect when the United States is withdrawing from or threatening to withdraw from international organizations like the WHO or international treaties like the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
I think it's a terrible mistake. There are forces around the world that are more than happy to fill that vacuum. The United States is still the only country with not just the will, but the capacity to lead these institutions, not just in service of our own narrow self-interest, but for the common good. And people around the world look to us to do that. Our absence not only creates a vacuum that is filled by authoritarian powers such as China, it's also just plain dispiriting to good people around the world who need the United States to be playing that role, who need to see this powerful country, at least most of the time, trying to do the right thing. If we don't, who will? I've often said that in my travels around the world, I visited refugee camps, I visited countries in conflict. I've never met a single person who walked up to me to say, Tom, I'm really, really furious at France for not helping us. I'm really pissed off that China is not coming here and stopping this civil war or righting this wrong. They are often angry at the United States because they expect better from us. They expect us to play that role. And I don't think that's changed, despite the damage to America's image that this administration has created. People still believe America can be that country and want us to be that country. And I think we will have the opportunity. I am hopeful we will have the opportunity to rise to that challenge again soon.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you again, sir. Really appreciate it. I'd like to shift a little bit and get your thoughts on some issues related to globalization. When you think about the flow of people across borders for various reasons, what is the impact on the stability of democracies in our own hemisphere here, but also around the world?
I would have said until recently that it can only be positive, because the more we get to know each other, the more ideas spread across the world, the harder it is for dictatorships to isolate their people from challenging ideas. North Korea is, of course, the perfect example of a dictatorship that has stayed in power in part by denying its people the opportunity to learn of the existence of different ways of life. And when I was at the State Department working with refugees like Joseph, we ran programs to get information inside North Korea, books and movies and TV shows and internet access where possible, because we thought that would help to open up the country. I think the problem is twofold, though. Number one, sometimes with free movement of people of goods, there's insecurity that goes along with that. There's economic dislocation, as we mentioned. For every million good people who travel, there's one bad guy. There's a terrorist who can do a tremendous amount of harm. And so that openness does create an opportunity for authoritarian populists to spread fearful ideas. And number two, and I think this deserves a deeper conversation, the way in which information spreads across the world has changed very dramatically in the last decade, because we now get most of our information through social media, not through mediated news sources that are open to multiple ideas, but that are actually managed by human editors who make responsible decisions about what is truthful and what is fake, about what is an important argument and what is just propaganda. The information we're getting now is totally unmediated, and it is directed at us not by responsible journalists, but by software algorithms that are designed to accentuate extreme views, to accentuate content that plays to our emotions, particularly our negative emotions. And the results are plain to see, from America to Brazil to India to Western Europe. Politics is increasingly driven by the extremes.
You noted there's an element of fear when it comes to perceptions on the flow of people across borders. And I'm wondering to what extent you think that may be rooted in a fear of loss of a national or cultural identity. And based on that, what might democracies do to address that fear?
We are in a better position to do so. We ought to be in a better position to do so in the United States, because our cultural identity is based on an idea. It's not based on skin color, religion, ethnicity. The idea of what it means to be American has always been, or at its best, it's always been. We are a country dedicated to democracy, to liberty, to the rule of law, to a particular conception of rights and responsibilities, and that people who from all around the world can come here and become American instantly if they embrace that set of rules, that contract. And I think Americans can still be inspired, and still are inspired by that idea, even if some of us unfortunately cling to the notion that to be American is to be white and Christian. So I think the United States has that advantage, because we can point to our founding ideals to promote a more open and generous definition of national identity. I think this may be a little harder for some other countries that don't have the same traditions, but I think they can certainly work to evolve in that direction, because I think this is something that America got right when we got started so many years ago.
And last question for me, as we think about some of the negative or perceived negative consequences of globalization, particularly when you think about local communities that have experienced dislocation through automation or immigration, or at least that's the perception, how can democracies help to strengthen these local communities and help them see the benefits of a more globalized world?
Well, we do have to take seriously legitimate fears and insecurities. That's the flip side of it. On immigration policy, for example, I believe we need to be open to refugees. I would support very generous asylum policies. I believe America is stronger when we welcome hardworking, entrepreneurial people from all around the world. I think a wall on the Mexican border is a stupid waste of money, but at the same time, I do believe that we are a rule of law country, and whatever laws we do have, that determine who can come here and who cannot do need to be enforced. And so people like me who favor very generous immigration, refugee, and asylum policies need to always start by reassuring folks and believing this, that immigration laws should be enforced, that of course we should police our borders. By the same token, I do think that an open liberal society does need to remember that there are significant dangers to our security, threats to our security coming from around the world. We do need to be concerned about terrorism. We do need to be concerned about problems halfway across the world, like the civil war in Syria, for example, which created massive refugee flows that I think contributed to the insecurity that many Americans and Europeans feel. We do have to invest in our military. We do have to be global leaders, in part because if we don't address these sources of insecurity, it will be harder to maintain a consensus at home for a tolerant, open, and liberal society.
Thank you, sir. Turn it over to Bill.
Now, let me wrap this up with this last one. Thinking here about China, you wrote recently in a op-ed about U.S. policy towards China that it would, we should frame this as a fight between competing ideals, not countries. So how do democratic capitalists best respond to China's authoritarian form of capitalism?
So I think we got to start with understanding what the contest is. We're not trying to defeat China. And in fact, in this contest, the people of China should be seen as allies, as people who largely share the values that we are trying to defend. It is a contest between two different ideas about how the world should be run. What we stand for is the rule of law. We stand for the notion that people and countries need to play by a common set of rules that are rooted in principles of respect for the dignity and equality of every person. And some of those are human rights rules. Some of those are trade rules. We don't want countries exploiting each other, stealing each other's intellectual property. Some of them are national security rules. We don't want big countries invading small countries or claiming large parts of the ocean as their exclusive territory, excluding others. We want these problems to be resolved by common adherence to a set of rules. That's what we're fighting about. And as long as we frame it in those terms, we're going to have allies from all across the world, other democracies, ordinary people, including ordinary Chinese people, will line up with us. If we make it about the United States versus China, our nation versus your nation, well, number one, we're going to lose every person living in China by definition. And even our closest allies are not eager to get involved in that kind of fight. Why should they favor the United States over China in some sort of nationalistic struggle? And without allies, we can't prevail. Not against a nuclear-armed great power with the power to hurt us in all kinds of ways. So that's the argument I made. Make it about ideas that are broadly shared. And if you agree with that, then how you win is not a hard thing to answer. We win by being different from China. We win by living the values that we are championing. We win by being open to refugees. We win by showing the world that we can resolve our domestic problems because of the strength of our democracy, not despite being a democratic and open society. And we win by rallying allies to take on the Chinese in a principled way on issues of trade and security and human rights.